The luxurious midnight express sliced through the darkness of the mountain forest, its polished mahogany interior glowing in the soft light of crystal lamps. A delicate sense of unease lingered in the air, barely perceptible yet undeniable, like the calm before a storm. Then a scream shattered the silence. It echoed through the narrow corridors, sending a jolt of fear through every passenger. Doors flew open, faces pale with shock, eyes wide with suspicion. As they rushed toward the final compartment, the smell of blood hit them first. Inside, Lord Henry Devereux lay motionless, his once stern face frozen in terror, a dagger still dripping with blood embedded in his chest. Each passenger stood in quiet shock, their eyes meeting briefly, but lingering questions remained unspoken. Could one of them truly be responsible for such a terrible act? The air was thick with unease, hinting at a truth far deeper than any of them could yet comprehend. But it wasn't always like this. Just a few hours earlier, the Midnight Express was calm, and the passengers had no idea that something dangerous was quietly building up. That night, the luxurious train known as the Midnight Express glided gracefully along the cold rails, slicing through the darkness of the mountain forest. Its interior design exuded classic luxury, with mahogany-paneled walls, softly glowing crystal lamps, and plush red velvet seats. However, beneath the glittering surface, a subtle but palpable tension crept like an unseen shadow. In one of the compartments sat a graceful woman named Amelia Devereux. Her skin was as white as porcelain, and her jet-black hair was neatly styled in a bun. Her sharp blue eyes scanned her surroundings with a cold elegance, as if no detail escaped her observation. Beside her sat her husband, Lord Henry Devereux, an elderly man with a stern face lined by the wrinkles of a lifetime. Henry was known for his wealth, but many saw him as arrogant and cruel. In another compartment, a young man named William Barrett stood nervously by the window. His gaze was fixed on the view outside, but his thoughts were far away. William was a writer searching for inspiration, but that night his mind was filled with worry. His usually bright smile had faded, replaced by a furrowed brow. Meanwhile, Brandon, a servant in a neat uniform, walked down the corridor delivering drinks. He paused briefly in front of the compartment occupied by Frederick March, a successful businessman who appeared calm and confident. Frederick was a man with silver blonde hair and a well-groomed beard. His eyes radiated intelligence and warmth, but behind his friendly smile lay hidden secrets. At the other end of the train, Eleanor Blackwood, a middle-aged woman with fading red hair, sat quietly reading a book. Her emerald green eyes glanced occasionally toward the door, as if waiting for something. Eleanor had been a famous actress in her youth, but she was now better known for a series of scandals that had overshadowed her career. There was wariness on her face, but there was also a strong determination, as if she was ready to face whatever might come. As the night grew deeper, the roar of the speeding train became the backdrop for conversations that gradually died down. As the passengers began to rest, the hidden tension among them slowly eased. However, a strange feeling lingered in the air, as if something terrible was about to happen. In the middle of the night, a scream shattered the silence, echoing throughout the train. All the passengers awoke with pounding hearts. Compartment doors flew open, and the passengers rushed out, only to find Brandon, the servant, looking terrified as he pointed toward a compartment at the end of the train. Inside that compartment, Lord Henry Devereux lay lifeless on his bed, a dagger still dripping with blood stuck in his chest. His usually stern face was frozen in an expression of shock and fear. As all the passengers gathered around the compartment door, their eyes met one another with growing suspicion. Who among them could have committed this terrible crime? Amelia, her face pale, stared blankly at her husband's body, while William seemed increasingly anxious, cold sweat running down his temples. Nearby, Frederick remained calm, but his eyes showed a deep confusion, while Eleanor stood a little further back, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if avoiding everyone else's eyes. As the night grew later, the atmosphere inside the train became more tense. All the passengers, now suspicious of one another, were gathered in the dining car by a detective named Mr. Clyde Hastings, who happened to be traveling on the train. Clyde, a man with a stern face and sharp eyes, decided to uncover the truth before the train reached its final station. At the long table, shining under the light of crystal lamps, Clyde began his analysis. One by one, he dissected the alibis and motives of each passenger. As the investigation began, dark secrets started to come to light. Every passenger had a reason to hate Lord Henry, but who was the real killer? Amelia, who appeared calm but pale, was the first to be accused because she was the closest to Lord Henry. Although she had always seemed like a devoted wife, Amelia secretly harbored a deep resentment. Clyde explained that Amelia had a strong motive because she had suffered for years under her husband's cruel treatment. However, the evidence was not strong enough to prove that Amelia was the murderer, even though the simmering anger was evident in her eyes. The investigation continued, and Clyde then turned his attention to William, the anxious writer who had been publicly humiliated by Lord Henry at a social gathering some time ago. On that occasion, Lord Henry insulted William by calling him a foolish and failed writer with no talent. Clyde presented evidence in the form of a threatening letter found in William's jacket pocket. William appeared to break into a cold sweat, but he insisted that the threat was merely an expression of his anger and not a real plan to harm anyone. His fragile demeanor suggested that William was more likely a victim than the killer. Soon after, Frederick, who had always maintained a calm expression, seemed shaken when Clyde uncovered his conflicts with Lord Henry. During the investigation, Clyde managed to reveal several fraudulent activities Frederick had engaged in while managing his business. These wrongdoings had been discovered by Lord Henry, who then used this information to intimidate Frederick into obeying his commands. Although Frederick had a strong motive to kill Lord Henry, Clyde found that he did not have the opportunity to commit the murder because he had an alibi and was continuously monitored by another witness at the time of the crime. Finally, Clyde turned his attention to Eleanor, revealing that she had a secret relationship with Lord Henry in the past. However, this forbidden affair ended in betrayal, which devastated Eleanor's life. Clyde found a piece of evidence in the form of an old love letter written by Eleanor. In the letter, she expressed her anger and pain over the betrayal and cruelty inflicted by Lord Henry. But like the others, this evidence only pointed to a motive, not certainty. Moreover, Eleanor also had an alibi for the time when the murder occurred. When Clyde seemed to run out of clues, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Everyone stared at the detective with a mix of fear and hope, wishing for the truth to be revealed, or for their secrets to remain hidden. The tension on the train reached its peak as each passenger tried to distance themselves from suspicion. Their gazes became more alert, their voices sharper, and every movement was closely watched by the others. But one thing was certain, the killer was still among them, and time was running out to uncover the truth before the train reached its final destination. As the train continued its journey through the dark night, carrying its hidden secrets, the lights in the carriage suddenly went out, causing the passengers to let out small screams. In the darkness, the sound of footsteps quickly approached, followed by the noise of someone falling and a cry of pain. Moments later, when the lights came back on, all eyes turned to Amelia, who appeared frightened, holding a dagger with blood dripping from its tip. In front of her lay Eleanor, with a wound on her stomach. But before anyone could react, Amelia immediately dropped the dagger and said that Eleanor had confessed to being the killer. In a weak voice, Eleanor, badly wounded, nodded and confessed that she killed Lord Henry to take revenge on him for betraying her and ruining her life. Seeing that Eleanor had suffered for years due to Lord Henry's cruelty, Amelia quickly knelt beside her and embraced her tightly. The two women, unable to contain their pain any longer, began to cry together, releasing the anger and hurt they had held onto for so many years. On the other side, Clyde, who had witnessed everything, just shook his head in pity. He tried to sympathize with the two women, knowing that Lord Henry had caused them years of suffering. However, Clyde sensed something strange about the confession and the incident involving Eleanor, as if both had been carefully planned by Amelia and Eleanor for their own benefit. After they laid Eleanor on a long sofa and tended to her wounds, Clyde announced to everyone that he would continue his investigation to uncover the truth behind Lord Henry's death. Hearing this, the others immediately objected, arguing that Eleanor's confession should be enough to close the case. Realizing that his efforts to reveal the truth would face opposition from the passengers involved in the murder, Clyde presented his brilliant deductions about the alibis and the possibility of each passenger being the killer. Although Eleanor had a strong motive to kill Lord Henry and had confessed to being the murderer, the evidence found at the crime scene suggested that everyone, not just Eleanor, had an equal opportunity to kill Lord Henry. As the investigation continued, Clyde finally discovered that the murder was not the result of personal revenge or a sudden burst of anger. Clyde was shocked to learn that the murder had been planned so cleverly and nearly perfectly. For the first time in his life, Clyde felt genuinely excited while investigating a case, as he had been misled and overlooked several details he initially considered unimportant. After instructing Brandon to keep an eye on Eleanor, who was resting in her compartment, Clyde gathered the other passengers in the dining car and announced that he had identified the real killer. He began his explanation by presenting new evidence he had uncovered. Clyde had discovered a hidden compartment inside William's suitcase containing letters and a diary that detailed a conspiracy between William and Frederick. Throughout the investigation, William had seemed the most confused and least likely suspect to harm anyone, so Clyde initially dismissed these small details. However, after conducting a deeper investigation, Clyde found that William had been secretly working with Frederick, whose financial troubles were far worse than anyone had realized. Frederick had orchestrated a scheme to kill Lord Henry by manipulating others so that he wouldn't have to dirty his hands himself. The letters revealed that Frederick had manipulated William into believing that killing Lord Henry would give him a fresh start and an escape from his failures. In those letters, Frederick also blamed Lord Henry for his financial ruin and described his suffering in great detail to stir William's emotions and convince him that the murder was necessary to save them all. Frederick then provided William with detailed knowledge of Lord Henry's routines and vulnerabilities, along with a brilliant plan to convince William they could carry out the murder without anyone finding out. Additionally, Frederick promised financial support to William in return for his cooperation. Motivated by desperation and a misguided sense of justice, William eventually agreed to the plan. However, William was not the only one involved in the murder. Clyde also revealed the involvement of Amelia and Eleanor, even though their roles in the crime were minor. He discovered evidence that Amelia had been having an affair with Frederick and was aware of the murder plot. Frederick had not only managed to manipulate Amelia into supporting his plan, but he had also convinced Eleanor to join the conspiracy. He deliberately approached the vulnerable and fragile Amelia, promising love and loyalty to win her over. Seducing Amelia was easy for Frederick, but persuading Eleanor took more time, although he eventually succeeded in gaining the support of both women. At this point, Clyde turned to Frederick, looking at him sharply, and explained that Frederick's role in inciting them and manipulating the situation made him the true mastermind behind the crime. On the fast-moving train headed toward its final station, Clyde revealed the truth behind Lord Henry's death, which turned out to be far more horrifying than he had initially imagined. Although Lord Henry was cruel and disliked by many, that was no reason to murder him. William and the others looked pale as Clyde presented his deductions and solved the case. However, even though the truth had been uncovered, Frederick appeared calm and confident that he would not be caught, especially since William had been proven to be the murderer and Eleanor had confessed to her involvement in the crime. With his experience as a private detective and his ability to quickly understand people's true natures, Clyde had realized that Frederick was a cunning man who would not hesitate to do anything, even betray those closest to him, for his own gain. For this reason, Clyde had deliberately hidden the one piece of undeniable evidence that proved Frederick was the true murderer. Clyde then pulled several photographs from his jacket pocket and spread them out on the table. As a private detective, Clyde always acted quickly and followed police procedures, such as keeping people away from the crime scene and taking photos of the victim for investigation purposes. Knowing he couldn't touch Lord Henry's body, Clyde took out his pocket camera and started photographing the corpse. At that moment, Clyde noticed cherry-red bruises on the victim's body, indicating that Lord Henry had not been stabbed to death but poisoned. Although Clyde could not find the poison itself, he did find a receipt for cyanide in the trash bin inside Frederick's compartment. Clyde immediately placed the receipt in a clear plastic bag so that forensic officers could identify fingerprints on it. At first, Frederick denied that the receipt was his. However, William, who was visibly burdened with guilt, confessed his mistakes and revealed everything. Instead of admitting his wrongdoing, Frederick tried to attack Clyde, intending to kill the detective to cover up his crimes. Fortunately, Clyde had good fighting skills, allowing him to subdue Frederick and handcuff him to a support pole to prevent him from escaping. In the end, on the train that continued its journey toward its final destination, the truth was revealed, leaving the darkness behind and bringing a story of betrayal, love, and tragic revenge. Lord Henry's death, though cruel, brought enlightenment to all involved, albeit at a high price. Frederick still refused to admit his guilt, and instead tried to justify his actions by claiming that he had only done what was necessary to protect himself. He added that Lord Henry was a harsh and cruel man who deserved to die. Hearing this, Clyde replied that everyone would die, but taking someone's life in such a brutal way could never be justified for any reason. Clyde added that Frederick was far worse than Lord Henry because he did not hesitate to manipulate and use others for his own benefit. Upon hearing this, William and the others deeply regretted their decision to conspire with Frederick, realizing that, in the end, Frederick would have betrayed them all. The train finally arrived at its final destination, a quiet station under the light of the new dawn. Passengers began to disembark one by one, carrying with them memories of the terrifying night on the Midnight Express. The police quickly boarded the train to apprehend Frederick and everyone involved in the murder. While the police and forensic officers worked at the crime scene, Clyde gazed out the window, looking at the small town that welcomed them. With steady steps, Clyde stepped off the train, leaving the night of mystery behind him and walking toward the morning light that signaled a new beginning, not just for him, but for everyone involved in the tragedy. Clyde felt relieved that the case had been solved, but he also felt the weight of all the secrets and suffering uncovered in the process. The once majestic train, the Midnight Express, was now empty. However, the memories of that night, which changed so many lives, would remain in their minds and forever be a part of their journey toward an uncertain but hopeful future.